Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'll get to my promise from last time to describe more about Headquarters Joint Operations Command in a moment, because it was a rare experience to go out there, and I'm not sure to what extent it's been described by any of the other journalists. I want to encourage defence to do these things, so I'll get to that in a moment. However, in the breaking news department, there's more follow-up from US President Donald Trump and the effect that he's having on the international order. Last week I mentioned tariffs on US allies Canada and Mexico, withdrawn after about 24 hours, and threats to invade Greenland and Panama. And those threats don't seem to have gone away. At least they haven't been formally withdrawn. However, for the last few days, the one obviously that's been getting all of the attention is President Trump's idea of getting all Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip and then rebuilding the area as a luxury, as he calls it, Riviera on the Mediterranean. That's even though two Rivieras already exist on the Mediterranean, namely in France and Italy, so I guess this will be the third Riviera. And I note that geography doesn't seem to be a particularly strong suite of the president's. Now, personally, I don't think this is a particularly good idea, because it involves the ethnic cleansing of 2 million Palestinians with no real idea of where they will go. I also wonder what happens to those who don't want to leave the devastated area. Presumably they are going to be shoved out at the point of a bayonet. It's also not clear who will spend the plus $100 billion to transform this area into Riviera Mark III. Now, that's just my view, and unfortunately you won't hear anything this strong from the Australian government, because for them this represents the absolute worst of both worlds, a risk of offending the US and Israel. Well, we can't have that, can we? I'll come back to the US in a moment in the context of AUKUS, but there's a very large missing piece of commentary here, particularly from the media. And, okay, time for another quiz. This thing, the two-state solution, involves, well, two states. One of them is Palestine, and the other one is, guesses anyone? Two states? Palestine is one, the other one? Now, for the second state, if you said Israel, you would be absolutely correct. And the current right-wing government of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu is not at all interested in a two-state solution. So while there's been a lot of focus on Trump and the US, there has been almost none on Israel itself. And I noticed Benjamin Netanyahu smirking and gloating next to Donald Trump as he was outlining his proposal for Riviera Mark III. Now, I can say this because I've always been a strong supporter of Israel, and that allows me to point out that you cannot have a two-state solution if one of the parties has ruled it out. In a practical sense, Israel's continuing, possibly accelerating, construction of Jewish settlements on the West Bank also works very powerfully against such a long-term peaceful two-state solution. What the hardliners in the Israeli government want is not just all Palestinians kicked out of Gaza, but they want them kicked out of the West Bank as well. Where does the Australian government, and for that matter the opposition, stand on all of this? Well, we aren't really sure, because the statements coming out of both parties are extremely vague, motherhood sort of stuff. I observe if Australia is not prepared, or if the Australian government is not prepared to stand up and speak clearly when we see something wrong taking place, we cannot expect anyone else to stand with us if ever we are in the firing line. And you just can't rule out the possibility that one day that might happen. But let's now go back to the US and AUKUS and the recent visit of Defence Minister Richard Marles. The high point, as far as I can tell, was new US Defence Secretary Peter Hegseth saying he hoped subterraneans for Australia would be ready on time. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say he meant submarines rather than subterranean. I was hoping perhaps for something a little more concrete, hoping that they would be on time, but there you go. Now, I'm not in a position to monitor all media, but from what I've seen of the reporting, it's all along the lines that this is wonderful news for Australia because the Trump administration supports AUKUS. But why would they not support AUKUS? Australia has just handed over $800 million with another $4.2 billion to go. People need to understand this $5 billion, this isn't a down payment or ordering long lead time items. It's a gift, and a gift without a refund clause. We will be paying separately untold billions for the two second-hand clunkers themselves if the deal goes ahead. Now, on top of this, we have US Marines effectively based in Darwin, B-52s at Tyndall, and recently some B-2 bombers as well. And from 2027, Virginia-class submarines will be permanently based in Western Australia, and we are spending $7 billion of our own money on facilities for those 4 submarines. The US now has more assets based in Australia than at any time since the end of the Second World War. We are giving $5 billion of our money to US submarine shipbuilding companies such as Electric Boat and Huntington Ingalls when our own industrial base is shrinking. And sections of the media are siding with the government that this is a wonderful deal for Australia. I take a somewhat different view. If any country on earth is in a position to express even mild discontent with the US, it's Australia. We are the 4th or 5th largest purchaser every year of US hardware. We have joined with them in every conflict since World War I, and we still cower in terror rather than saying anything that could possibly be interpreted as criticism. Yes, the US is undoubtedly Australia's most important security partner. No argument from me about that at all. But there are other countries out there. It's not just all about the US. And what must they think of Australia and this ongoing craven forelock tugging? From Copenhagen, Ottawa, and Panama City, we must look like the most pathetic, abject bootlickers they have ever seen. The low standing of both the government and coalition in the opinion poll suggests to me that more than 1/3 of Australians have a similar view. Now to happier things and the promised bit of information about the visit to Headquarters Joint Operations Command, and I'll start by mentioning that one of my colleagues and friend, the ABC's Andrew Green, their defence correspondent, probably known to many of you, has absolutely no idea how to open the bonnet of his car so that the engine compartment can be inspected by security. And I guess that, like me, his mind is probably too highly trained for such mundane activities. Once we got in, which took a bit of time because of the engine compartment issue, the visit started with a briefing. Remember, all of this is on background. I can't attribute it to an individual. We were in the main command room, I guess, which has a huge floor-to-ceiling and wall-to-wall full-colour electronic display made up of numerous reconfigurable screens. The centrepiece of this very large display was an electronic map of Australia and the surrounding region, going north of the equator and some distance out into the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Some of the minor screens were live streaming TV pictures, though presumably during a time of crisis they would be displaying information from who knows what and where. Australia has a number of surveillance assets, the Jindalee Over-the-Horizon Radar Network, P-8 aircraft, soon Triton, huge uninhabited aerial systems, all of that sort of stuff. There were individual operator stations for, I'm guessing, about 50 people from all 3 services, and I'm sure it wasn't a coincidence that the presentations that we received were in fact from people reflecting those different uniforms. It's already a big place, and it will soon get even bigger. The numbers on site vary quite a bit, from probably 600 on a very quiet day and up to around 2,000 if there's a fully blown crisis. A number of other agencies are present, including departments such as Foreign Affairs and representatives of the intelligence community and the Australian Federal Police. Allies are also on base, the Americans to monitor how the colony of Australia is behaving, plus all the other usual suspects such as the UK and Japan. Again, the numbers and exact composition will vary depending on the operation. The one part of the briefing that was on the record was the introduction from Chief of JOC, Vice Admiral Justin Jones, and I'll conclude this section by reading a couple of quotes from him. He said to us, "Our mission here at Headquarters Joint Operations Command is to employ integrated forces and effects in competition and conflict to defend Australia and its national interests. Through our Theatre Campaign Plan, we plan and execute operations, activities, and investments in our primary area of military interest and around the world. In 2025, deployments of the Joint Force in all domains, alongside our joint exercises, will play a vital role in ensuring Australia's security and prosperity. These operations, activities, and investments support the global rules-based order, enhancing our cooperation and relationships with regional partners and allies, and developing Defence's capability and interoperability. This year will see Defence conduct a number of important activities with our partners at home and overseas, including the largest iteration of Exercise Talisman Sabre from mid-July and Exercise Alon, ALON, with the Philippines as part of Indo-Pacific Endeavour 2025 towards the end of the year." They were the words of Vice Admiral Jones, and I'd like to finish this little segment by thanking everyone who helped organise that visit and who participated in it. Clearly, these things always require planning and attention to detail. When you've got a bunch of pesky, nosy journalists there, we were treated with great professional courtesy. All of us appreciated the time and effort that was put in. As I've said, may these things continue. Before entirely leaving that, the other thing worth mentioning is that the people on base we spoke to were all positive about the role of the Australian media, and I really hope that gets through to the senior ranks of the ADF. As was pointed out to us by several people, all of the families and friends of staff at HQ JOC rely on the media to tell them what Defence is up to, and the more information they can share with us, the better. That was their view. And that, of course, is a view I fully endorse, and that's a nice concluding segue to the stupidity of C-3000 and the blanket of total secrecy thrown by Defence over the project that was, one of the main themes in the previous podcast and a few before that. As it happened, a few journalists were having one of our occasional Hotel Kingston lunches last Friday, and we all had a similar thought. Since the bidders, just Submarine Systems from Germany and MHI from Japan, can be excluded from the competition for the simple sin of speaking with the media about the C-3000 requirement, you wondered what would happen if a few of us were to say to Defence, well, actually both TKMS and MHI have mentioned the Australian requirement. Well, what happens then? Will Defence bureaucrats go to the government and wring their hands and say both Germany and Japan should be excluded from the competition? They're in breach of their undertakings. Will the AFP be going to Tokyo and Hamburg to arrest people with the cooperation of Interpol? I think not. I think that if any Defence bureaucrats appeared before the National Security Committee of Cabinet and said we've got to terminate this competition because some company people have broken the rules and spoken to journalists, we've got to call it all off and start again, I assumed that they would be laughed out of the place. Now, assuming that I'm right, I think most people could understand the logic of my argument, in that case, why put in place these appalling restrictions to begin with? It makes no sense at all. Now, we also had the thought, and I do admit that alcohol might have been involved in this thinking, we thought another way around this restriction about the Australian C3000 requirement was because what would happen if we spoke to the bidders about a mythical island continent about the same size of Australia's, purely coincidentally, we'll call it Moronia, and the Moronian Navy had come up with certain requirements such as the need for ships to have a combat system. The Moronian Navy had developed their own combat system. How would the bidders respond in such a hypothetical situation? One of the bidders, for example, might say, well, look, that's still all a little bit too complicated. This is a new undertaking for us. We'd be much more comfortable sticking with what we know, besides which, if we have to work with a Moronian Navy combat management system, we have to disclose a whole lot of sensor data, interface stuff that we're not yet comfortable with doing. Another bidder might say, well, look, in such a hypothetical circumstance, we would probably look at this and think, well, the Moronian Navy doesn't really know what is in their best interests, and so we would voluntarily include the option of their own combat management system, so hopefully they can wake up and finally realize that this is a good idea. Now, if defence were to take journalists and companies to court and somehow try and argue that the C3000 guidelines had been breached because of this sort of fairly transparent fabrication, one wonders what the result would be. I'm doing this just again to illustrate how completely ridiculous this whole thing is. I'm going to conclude on a slightly pessimistic note, and far be it from me to take advantage of the very serious natural disaster that is continuing to unfold in far north Queensland with record-breaking, devastating floods. Wouldn't it be nice if the Army had a fleet of modern 10-ton utility helicopters that they could deploy to assist the flood relief effort? Well, we don't. And I've, of course, discussed that extensively. So because of the dismantling, destruction of the fleet of Taipan helicopters, not only did Ukraine miss out on them, but the Australian people miss out on having access to them as well. Speaking of Ukraine, I'll have a little bit more to say next week. We're in uncertain times with US support for the moment unclear. Australia should be doing more to help. The delivery of M1A1 main battle tanks seems to be going very slowly. And a breaking story, I think that, and I might have hinted at this before, I think that Army are up to their old tricks with the Tiger armed reconnaissance helicopters. I am pretty sure that Army is in the process of destroying those as well, so that in 1 or 2 years' time, they can turn around and say to the Ukrainians who have requested them, so sorry, we would love to have helped you out, but there are no helicopters left. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.